talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
I'm pretty good, and you?
Good. I'm excited. Today we've got a guest from inside the Beltway, and it's not somebody who's going to divide the country. We're going to talk about identity and access management topics, which I think at this point are probably one of the last safe areas. It should be a safe zone. Yeah. So far, we give it time.
Right. Exactly. We're actually going to talk about zero trust today, which has been top of mind for a lot of people. And actually, I know a lot of our customers, Jim, you and I have been having conversations with from an advisory perspective, have expressed a great interest in this area. And I think it's something that is going to be interesting to discuss with our guests. And let's bring her on. We've got Rebecca Nielsen. She's the Director of Technology Integration at PKH Enterprises. She's joining us today, and we might actually also be blessed with an appearance by Trouble the Cat, who may or may not appear as part of her microphone feed. We will see how that goes. Welcome to the show, Rebecca.
Thank you.
So, Rebecca, you recently gave a presentation at Identiverse around zero trust and whether it was hype or game changer. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes for today. But there's a chance it may not be there by the time people are listening to this. So apologize in advance if that's not there, but it's there as of right now. So we checked right before the show to make sure that was there. But before we get into the zero trust stuff, maybe you can talk to our audience. How did you get into identity and access management? Is it something that you chose or something that chose you?
So it's definitely something that chose me. I actually came to identity management via public key technology. I ended up supporting a very early implementation of a public key infrastructure for the Department of the Navy. And I still remember a conversation I'd had with a security officer before then who told me, oh, you really should consider a career in security. You'd really like it. And I remember telling them, no, I was not interested. And now 25 years later, this is what I am doing full time. So via PKI, which is obviously a key credential piece of identity management, sort of broadening the picture because it's not the only piece that's important.
So from a zero trust perspective, maybe we can start with that. So do you want to spoil it? Is the hype legitimate for zero trust, or should we let people kind of wonder?
I think we'll start at the end. There's a lot of hype in zero trust. And one of the things that I found very interesting, so even doing a little bit of market research on zero trust, is that a lot of the data that's out there is about what zero trust isn't. It isn't a technology. It isn't a complete solution. But on the other hand, so there is a lot of hype. There are a lot of vendors selling, well, you must buy this because then you will achieve zero trust, which of course contradicts the analyst statements about how zero trust isn't a thing. But zero trust is a philosophy, and it's a different way of looking at how you integrate and orchestrate various pieces of cybersecurity, including identity management, together to sort of achieve a more effective implementation, more effective security. So there's a lot of hype in zero trust, but we'll say it is also something that is worth looking into to find the pieces that can work for you.
How do you define zero trust? If you were going to give a 30-second elevator speech to someone who doesn't know anything about it, what do you tell them?
So I would define it, and I will tell you this is probably not how you'll see it defined on the internet. I would define it really as a collection of security technologies that you integrate together to achieve better assurance and better access to your sensitive data. So specifically, it's identity management, because if you don't know who's asking, then you can't control how you're sharing it. Endpoint management, what are the devices that are being used to share that information? Network segmentation is a big piece. So the idea that networks are not always connected, but that you have to create a permission for a network connection before you get access to a resource. And then obviously managing the data itself, understanding the importance of various pieces of data within your enterprise, And then the final piece that Zero Trust adds in is kind of the user behavior analytics of being able to use real-time monitoring to be constantly making decisions about, is this connection still trustworthy?
Are there any specific best practices that you can think of when it comes to enacting a Zero Trust architecture or maybe even it's a program, right, within an organization?
So I think the first best practice really is to take an inventory of where you're at. What are you already doing? And do these things that you're already investing in, do they talk to each other? Does your endpoint team that is hopefully doing some management about putting patches onto your operating systems, maintaining any sort of virus protection or malware protection, are they talking to your identity management people who are looking at authenticating a device as it comes onto the network or authenticating the user of that device? Or are they completely separate silos? So I think the really first lesson learned is get your different security teams all on the same page so that they are looking at how to move forward together, not at each technology as a separate thing.
I guess in my mind, how I always organize Zero Trust, or let's say the aspect that really jumps out at me is kind of the breaking down of the perimeter as a way to defend resources, cyber resources. So kind of, in my early days, I'm sure in your early days of IT in general, the idea was that the firewall is kind of the main point of defense, and we keep the bad guys out by having kind of a crunchy shell, if you will, and that allows you to have kind of the softer center. And so when this Zero Trust concept first came out, it was kind of revolutionary, right? Or it was going against that long-held belief that if you have a strong perimeter, you're safe, right? Because you're keeping the bad actors out. And why I really feel like Zero Trust has kind of gained a foothold over the past few years is that these data breaches are happening at an alarming rate. The trend is only that it's going to get much worse, and that a lot of the malicious actors are actually insiders. I mean, Jeff and I use a slide very often where we talk about the percentage of data breaches that are committed by insiders, and it's about a third. And Jeff, I don't know if you know the source for that, but I mean that's kind of alarming, right? And when you think about it from that perspective, firewall does you no good. I take it even a step further, that you then take a device home. We're all going in and out of networks, at least before COVID. Now we're mostly out of the network. But prior to COVID, you take a device home, potentially it gets compromised, and you bring it back and you put it on the network, and now you have a compromised device on the network that could be committing attacks without you even being aware. So I can see why why it's gaining such steam, and really I think Zero Trust and identity at the center, they kind of say the same thing, because we're looking at identity as kind of the new perimeter. So it's the point where you can actually secure data. It's using the identity and strong authentication. So then that strong authentication tying back to usernames and passwords very often, that's just not a sufficient control. I mean, passwords are, let's assume that you're inside the network and you're trying to run a bot just to do credential stuffing. You can try thousands of passwords a second. And again, if that assumption is that you're on the network, you're somehow safer, you probably don't even have the network controls to detect or prevent that type of attack. So, those were kind of some of my thoughts. Rebecca, I don't know if anything I said there kind of triggers any thoughts on your end.
Well, I do think sort of that what you talk about, the environment we live in that has sort of started this Zero Trust revolution. One of the comparisons I really think about is to medieval warfare. People built stronger and stronger walls, which were great until the enemy learned how to fly. It doesn't do any good to have a really strong wall if somebody's just coming over the top of it. And I think that is what we're seeing with this sort of traditional model of let me protect the boundary I'll do a lot of checks and balances before I let devices inside my boundary. And as you mentioned, we now live in a very federated world. I'm doing my job 100% from home. And yes, I'm using a workstation that was provided by my client, but I'm still coming from my home Wi-Fi network. So there's a lot of reliance that workstation is still itself secure. So doing that endpoint management of looking at the health check of the endpoint, because if that endpoint is compromised, it doesn't matter how good your identity is, anything that's seen on the endpoint will be seen by the attacker. I think the change in thought from assuming that if it's on the network, it's secure, to assuming that the bad guys are also on the network is a very important mind shift. And figuring out what's the best way to deal with that, I think, is a big piece of zero trust.
If I could just make one point to follow up, I think that it doesn't mean that being on the network isn't more secure, right? That's not what zero trust is stating. Is that it's not a control that you can rely on, that once somebody's in the network, they're safe, and some weak control like username and password is sufficient. We work with a lot of clients where they say, okay, well, they're on our network, so they, yes, that is better, right? If you're at least defending the perimeter with MFA, that's better than not. However, username and password just on the internal network or just a recognized device, I don't think is really complies with kind of the zero trust framework, if you will.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Rebecca, you brought up, you were provided a device in that example, right? There's a lot of people who are using personal devices to access resources within their organization, whether it's something SaaS based, Office 365, right? Concur, they're putting expenses in. Maybe even Zoom, right? They're making phone calls, right? And things like that. So being able to manage the endpoint may not always be an option for an organization, especially when suddenly thrust into this, massive work from home scaling that a lot of organizations had to do earlier this year. It's been a couple months. You kind of hope with fingers crossed that they've started to get a handle around it, right? But maybe they haven't. So not necessarily trusting the device, I think, is an important part of it as well. When it comes to zero trust itself as a concept, are there any limitations that organizations should be considering when they're looking to kind of go down that road?
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges anytime you're trying to do things like automated continuous monitoring, as it were, is at what point do you set a limit of allowing a computer to make a decision to cut somebody off? If you're doing risk monitoring, okay, this is maybe an unmanaged device, so that's already a ding on the risk score. You're looking at, okay, I've strongly authenticated the user, but as I monitor the behavior of the user, it appears that this user is not behaving in a way that user is expected to behave. So the zero trust piece of it is, well, when their risk score drops below a certain threshold, you either cut them off or you require them to re-authenticate, which sounds really good, except if it is a legitimate user, you don't really want to cut them off from being able to do their job. And if you're continually asking them to re-authenticate, your users are going to revolt. So it is still a need to kind of balance what do you automate and what do you decide you're going to manage maybe after the fact to be able to catch it. And I do think, because usability is also a very important piece for any sort of environment. When you're dealing with your own employees, you have a little bit of power to just say, suck it up and deal with it. When you're dealing with your customers, it becomes an even bigger challenge because you don't want to scare your customers off to your competitors.
You'll suck it up, Buttercup. No, you're right on, and that's the eternal balance we as IAM practitioners try to strike, is the balance between security and user experience. So in your presentation, you talked a bit about strong authentication. There's multi-factor authentication, there's continuous authentication, there's the term strong authentication, which has been around a while. What does that mean? How do you define that?
So every time I hear strong authentication, in my head, I replace it with strong enough authentication. There is no definition of strong authentication. It's another term that many of the vendors who are selling multi-factor authentication will tell you how important it is. And multi-factor authentication is more expensive both to implement, but it's significantly more expensive to hack. So it is better than single username password, but it doesn't mean it is the end all. I use usernames and passwords as a consumer every day, and the internet hasn't fallen apart and my life hasn't fallen apart. So in spite of the fact that all security experts agree that passwords are broken, we still use a lot of passwords because they're cheap and easy. So the question becomes, when is it okay to accept that kind of a risk? And when do you need to say no, even though it might be a little bit more costly and a little bit more infringing on the users? I need to do something better than just a password.
It revolves really around adapting the situation, right? I mean, what's the right authentication model to take? I don't know, I think of kind of like a house of the door, right? Maybe you've got a key for the front door, and then you've got a safe somewhere in the house that requires another key or some other kind of authentication. Strong authentication, I agree with you. It's a marketing term, right? That's all it is. And you hear all different variations on it. It's, super powered, encryption, still encryption, right? It's strong authentication is still just at somewhere a shared secret that somebody has with whatever service that they're using. So it's the definition of it probably doesn't exist outside of, a few different areas that are really more in the marketing side of things, but it encompasses the very important thing of having the appropriate level of security for the resource that you're trying to access.
Yeah, Jeff, I think with where you're going with that is it's what are you trying to protect and what are the sufficient levels of control? I mean, if you were talking about criminal records or hospital records or banking data, passwords are not going to be sufficient. I certainly wouldn't want my banking data, the ability to transfer my money out to be reliant just on passwords. At the same time, there are some services where maybe that is good enough. So I think that's the real balance. I think what is real key here, though, is having a framework to apply and how you think about this problem. I know there's the NIST standard that Frank mentioned on the previous podcast, one of our previous podcasts, talking about NIST 800-63 level of assurance framework, where you kind of think about, what is the risk that the risk of the data being accessed, and then what are appropriate security controls, and they provide a framework for that. Rebecca, I know that you're in the Beltway. You're probably very familiar with the ICAM framework, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the federal government uses the term Identity, Credential, and Access Management, or ICAM, and they have a FICAM services framework that's available. I'm sure we can post a link to that. And it's a good way of looking at all of the pieces that go into this concept of authentication and authorization, all the way from identity proofing, who are you, to credential issuance, how do I connect you to a digital identity, to managing attributes, what do I know about you, and then using that information to make that eventual decision about whether you're going to get access to a resource or not. And I think one of the challenges, and zero trust just adds a level of complexity, is there are so many moving parts, and some of them are technology based, some of them have to do with cryptography and standards, and some of them are simply processes and procedures. And if your process has a hole in it, it doesn't matter how good your technology is.
That sounds an awful lot like identity and access management. Who has access to what, right? It's the federal version, the U.S. government version of that. And I guess I'm not seeing too much of a difference there, other than, there's usually a vetting process, right? Things that FedRAMP, for example, is something that the U.S. Government uses a lot to kind of vet technologies and vendors maybe that are going to be providing services, and it's a shared type of approach to that type of thing. Does FICAM or ICAM, depending on however you want to call it, does it fit along with things like FedRAMP, or is that totally separate?
So it's a little bit separate. So FedRAMP is sort of a certification process that says, hey, I'm going to look at all the different ways you're doing stuff from a technology perspective, perspective to make sure it meets a certain set of standards. I think ICAM is a little, in some ways, it's broader because it looks at what are the people processes as well as the technology. In some ways, it's narrower because it's focused on the specific piece of, identity and access, and not necessarily on the technology underlying, say, the cloud.
So, Rebecca, in that whole discussion about strong enough authentication, what are some additional thoughts what are some additional takeaways that you think people out there should really be thinking about when they're making that evaluation themselves?
Yeah, so ideally, strong enough authentication would mean that the cost to execute a successful hack would be more expensive than the value of the resources you're going to get as a result of that attack. And one thing that's kind of important to think about there is that the value of a resource might be different to a hacker than it is to the organization that holds the resource. So, for example, this was one I actually heard about from a few years back, where a hacker actually hacked a taxi database to find out when taxis had been going in certain places, mapped that to an address database, and used it to get blackmail information about who was visiting hookers. So the value of the data to the attacker was different than the value of the data to the dispatch service, which simply wanted to make sure they had taxis in the right place at the right time. So it also is important to think about what is the value of this resource to the potential adversary. Now, in the real world, it's not always possible to make that happen. So in the real world, what's important is to do a risk assessment between the cost of implementing these stronger authentication factors balanced against the cost of mitigation or the cost of what would happen if an attack were to occur. Reputation, is there insurance that you should be holding just in case something happens? What is the cost to implement the stronger authentication? And what is the cost of lost users, lost customers, if it's much harder to get through your system than your competitors? So what's really important from sort of a maturity perspective isn't always what you choose as your authentication mechanisms. It's whether you've really done the right risk assessment to make that decision.
Oh, the things you learn on the Identity at the Center podcast. But, it reminded me of a previous discussion we had about the MGM resorts. They had a data breach, and there were at least theoretical belief that it was a state-sponsored attack, probably very much along those lines, where they wanted to gain intelligence about U.S. business executives so they could use it for blackmail. And my assumption was pretty much in alignment with that story that you told there, which, if you were at an MGM resort hotel in Las Vegas on such and such a date when you were supposed to be at a conference in Omaha, boy, that sure doesn't add up. And you might not want that coming out, right? So you wouldn't even think that would be the way that data could get used, but it was like a very sophisticated attack to get this data that didn't have credit card numbers and things like that. And so I think your point is well taken. You have to, and this is one of the things that we've talked about in previous podcast episodes. You need to think like the enemy or the adversary, right? You need to think about how would they go about performing an attack. What could they use our data for? Not only what is the obvious, like, okay, credit card numbers, you're going to dump those on the dark web and try and sell them, but, information about people's, travel history.
Well, and I think even sort of the core information that's in like the big data collection organizations, when they were basically using that data to figure out your mortgage FICO score, they had probably very few people trying to attack them. But when knowledge-based authentication suddenly became popular, that data became very valuable. And those system owners learned very quickly how vulnerable their databases were to attack. So the value of data also changes over time, sometimes because of things you might not have any control over.
I just want to point out something. I think our show has really gone down the tubes the last couple of weeks, because last week we had Frank, who talked about passwords being the herpes of IAM. Now we've got Rebecca talking about hookers and taxis. I mean, I don't know where this where the show is going to go, but I kind of like it. But just going to toss that out there. Yeah, for sure. Rebecca, you've been super generous with your time, and before we go, one of the things that we also like to find out from other folks in our industry is, what are the resources that they use to stay sharp from a IM perspective? Are there any websites, conferences, podcasts, hint, that you use to kind of stay up to date on the things that you focus on a day-to-day basis?
Well, of course, this podcast must be the most important resource. But there are, interestingly enough, I mostly just periodically go off and do an internet search. There's a lot of data that's out there. Much of it is put together by the vendors themselves. And there's a lot of good vendors with a lot of really great research. So I'm not going to give a marketing call out to any of them, but there are, just look up IDAM, look up some of these terms and download some of the white papers. Don't just look at their pretty web pages, but actually download their white papers. The Identiverse is maybe the biggest identity conference, but there are a number of smaller ones, and there are also just a number of resources. And like I said, I often just go look at sometimes the random ones just to see what's out there, because it's something that's always changing and it's always evolving. And so there's not really one good source. The same really is true of Zero Trust. There's some really good sort of core books about Zero Trust, but a lot of it, just go see what hype the vendors are selling. Once you've read it from 4 different vendors, you start to figure out what are the real things behind it.
Yeah, try not to fall prey to the marketing machine, right, of any type of specific vendor out there, and do the research.
You mentioned the NIST Special Publication 800-63. That's kind of the government standard for identity proofing and authenticator security. They also talk a little bit about federation, of sort of sending assertions around, which is how single sign-on is implemented mostly today, some of it better than others. The ICAM architecture is a really good sort of high-level introduction to the various ICAM pieces at arch.idmanagement.gov. And another document that I've actually been working on, the Department of Defense just published their new ICAM reference design document. And that is now published at the DoD-CIO website, which is dodcio.defense.gov/library. So those are, again, it's just kind of a good introduction to some of the concepts and what other people are thinking about in this space.
That's all good information. I'm going to put links to those things in the show notes here, so we'll have those out there for folks to be able to check out. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca. Before we close it up for the week, Jim, anything that you want to throw out there?
Yeah, it's just something I thought of as Rebecca was talking about and thinking about frameworks. This is, to me, frameworks for what we do is absolutely critical. So that 800-63, it's kind of required reading if you're an IAM practitioner. It's interesting. I had a CIO / boss one time who said, consultants sell bureaucracy, which I think is kind of a pessimistic view of what we do. But, when you think about frameworks and formality, they bring a lot of value to the organization, but they do make things take longer. But, as we've seen kind of over, I'll just use the example of agile methodologies. I think when you look at agile methodologies for deploying technology, they can be tremendously effective at cutting out waste from the system development lifecycle process. However, I think some people kind of abuse that agile methodology and use it as an excuse to not do project management, not come up with a plan. In other words, let's just start coding. And so I think that, again, frameworks and formality and process, they're important pieces to what we do. And just pointing to things like the ICAM and things like that NIST 800-63, invest some time. Frameworks essentially give you a way of looking at a problem, give you a way of thinking about a problem, and then give you hopefully I like to think of it as like a grid. If you end up on this point on the grid, then it should tell you kind of what the minimum requirement is. So, that's just kind of my thought for the day.
So have a plan. Move fast and break things is probably not where you want to be from an identity management kind of concept. Follow those kinds of strategies that others have built, right? These are essentially best practices, and you can avoid some of the mistakes potentially that others have made. So I think that's a pretty good spot to leave it. Rebecca, again, thank you so much for taking the time with us. I'm very disappointed that we did not hear Trouble the Cat, but maybe next time we can have that take place. So with that, we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. And thank everybody for listening. You can find out more about the show at identityatthecenter.com. And you can also follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcasts. We'll have a whole bunch of links in the show for this week, including links to Rebecca on LinkedIn if you want to connect with her, as well as the Identiverse on demand, if it's still there, and other things around FICAM and NIST and Department of Defense documents, the reference design, all that good stuff. So with that, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you all with the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.